It wasn't the cold that woke her up that night. It was the lights, red and blue, flooding the rear-view mirror of her Subaru, painting the inside of the car in colors that didn't belong on a residential street at 11:47 on a Tuesday. Corporal Tatum Brooke, 2 tours in Kandahar, 3 years at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, 1 torn ACL that never fully healed, pressed the brake, put the car in park, and let out a slow breath. She'd driven this stretch of Carling Avenue 100 times. She knew every pothole. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't run anything. She put both hands on the wheel and waited. The officer took his time getting out of the cruiser. She watched him in the mirror. Young, broad shoulders. The kind of walk that said he'd decided something before he even reached her door. She lowered the window. Evening, he said. Not a question. A declaration. Good evening, officer. She kept her voice level. She'd learned long ago that the only thing that mattered in the first 30 seconds was tone. License and registration, of course. She reached slowly for the glove compartment, the way she always did, the way she'd trained herself to do, slow and visible, nothing sudden, nothing that could be misread. She placed both documents in his outstretched hand. He looked at them for a long time, longer than necessary. His flashlight swept across the back seat, across the passenger seat, across her scrubs, dark blue, her hospital ID still clipped to her collar, and then came back to her face. You coming from somewhere? St. Michael's. I just finished a 12-hour shift. I'm a trauma nurse. St. Michael's is downtown. Yes, it is. I live off Fisher. I take Carling. Another pause. The flashlight moved again, this time lower, toward the floor of the car. You been drinking tonight? Tatum kept her hands on the wheel. No, I have not. You sure? I'm certain. He leaned slightly into the window. Step out of the vehicle, please. She turned her head to look at him directly, which she immediately understood was a mistake. Is there a specific reason? Step out of the vehicle. His voice had dropped half a register. Not louder, just harder. She stepped out. She favored her left leg as she did. The knee again, always the knee, especially after a long shift when the fluid built up and the joints stiffened. She'd stopped apologizing for it years ago. She just moved the way her body allowed her to move. The officer noticed immediately. You injured? Old injury. Surgical. My right knee. From what? She looked at him. From a vehicle-borne IED in Helmand Province in 2019. He didn't react the way people usually did. There was no pause of recognition, no slight shift in his expression. He just clicked his tongue and said, I'm going to need you to walk a straight line. Officer, walk the line. She walked it. She walked it as straight as she could, which was not perfectly straight, because her knee was swollen and her balance on the right side had never been the same since the surgery. She walked it knowing that whatever she did would be interpreted as evidence of something he'd already decided. When she turned back, he had his notepad out. I'm placing you under investigative detention. The words landed like a flat stone on still water. On what grounds? Her voice was quiet. That was deliberate, too. Suspected impairment, erratic movement, failure to walk a straight line. I told you I have a documented knee injury. I have surgical records at Ottawa General. I can provide. We'll sort it out at the station. He was already reaching for his radio. Hands behind your back, please. She stood on Carling Avenue in her scrubs, her hospital ID badge catching the red and blue light, and she thought, not for the first time in her life, but for the first time in this city, in this specific, quiet, mundane stretch of road, that the people she'd given years of her life to protect could still look right through her. She put her hands behind her back. The station was on Lycan Drive. She knew where it was. She'd dropped off a colleague there once after a minor fender bender. She'd sat in the waiting room while her friend sorted out insurance paperwork, and she'd thought, the way you think about places you assume will never have anything to do with you, that it seemed like a well-run building. The officer who'd cuffed her, his nameplate read Stroud, processed her in near silence. He answered her questions with one-word responses or not at all. When she asked whether she could call someone, he told her she'd have access to a phone shortly. When shortly turned into 40 minutes, she stopped asking. She sat in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto a hallway where people moved without urgency. A cup of water had been placed in front of her. She hadn't touched it. She was not, she reminded herself, afraid. She had been in rooms worse than this. She had been in situations where the outcome was genuinely uncertain in the way that this bureaucratic, procedural, infuriating situation was not. She had sat in a medical tent outside Kandahar with no power and a generator that kept cutting out and 3 patients whose vitals were going the wrong direction, and she had not been afraid, not exactly, not in the way that shut you down. But she was tired, and her knee was throbbing, and the fluorescent light overhead had a flicker in it that pulsed every few seconds in a way she was starting to find unbearable. The door opened. The man who walked in wasn't Stroud. He was older, mid-50s, she estimated, heavyset, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a suit jacket that had seen better days. He introduced himself as Sergeant Delisle, Professional Standards. She registered the words Professional Standards and felt something settle slightly in her chest. Mrs. Brooke. He sat down across from her. Corporal Brooke, I should say. I apologize for the wait. What's happening? He set a folder on the table but didn't open it. Officer Stroud has filed a report citing suspected impairment. That report is being processed. He paused. It's also being reviewed. She looked at him. Reviewed. We have camera systems in this building. We also have dashcam footage from Officer Stroud's vehicle. That footage has been flagged by a second officer who reviewed it earlier tonight. He cleared his throat. That officer is waiting outside. He asked whether you'd be willing to speak with him. Tatum was quiet for a moment. Who is he? His name is Constable Aubin. He came on shift at midnight, reviewed the incident queue as part of standard handover, and flagged Stroud's report before I'd even seen it. Delisle's voice was careful, measured. He asked to be present when we spoke to you. He said, and I'm quoting here, that he didn't want you to sit in that room any longer than you already had. She thought about that. About a man she'd never met, reviewing footage on a handover queue at midnight, deciding that something was wrong, deciding to say so. Send him in, she said. Constable Aubin was younger than she expected, late 20s, maybe 30, with a kind of careful stillness that reminded her of medics she'd worked with in the field. People who'd learned to exist without wasting motion. He sat down. The first thing he said was, I'm sorry this happened. Not, I'm sorry you feel that way. Not, I'm sorry there was a misunderstanding. Just, I'm sorry this happened. Tatum had been around long enough to know the difference. Tell me what you saw, she said. He walked her through it methodically. The dashcam had captured the entirety of the traffic stop. Tatum's car had been traveling at 48 kilometers per hour in a 50 zone. She had yielded immediately and pulled to a clean stop within 3 seconds of Stroud activating his lights. The recording showed no erratic driving, no lane deviation, no behavior consistent with impairment. It also showed Stroud's approach, his initial positioning, the way he'd leaned into the window. And it showed Tatum, hands on the wheel, speaking clearly, responding directly, flagging her injury before being asked to perform the field test. He knew about the knee before he asked you to walk the line, Aubin said quietly. Yes, that's in the recording. And then he proceeded. A beat. The sobriety test he administered is not a validated field test under the Ontario standard. It's a modified version, which is not technically against procedure, but combined with the rest of the recording. He stopped. I flagged it to Sergeant Delisle. What happens now? Delisle leaned forward. Tonight you're released. Unconditionally. No charges. The detention report is being pulled pending a formal review. He glanced at Aubin, then back at her. Officer Stroud has been placed on administrative duties pending that review. Tatum absorbed this. That's one incident report. Yes. Have there been others? The silence that followed her question was its own answer. She called her sister from the parking lot at 1:15 in the morning. The cold had settled properly by then, the kind of Ottawa January cold that gets into your ears and makes your thoughts feel slower. Her Subaru had been brought to the station by a duty officer. Another thing she hadn't been told would happen, another thing she'd had to piece together from fragments of conversation she wasn't quite supposed to hear. Her sister, Gwen, who lived in the glebe and worked in labor law and had a voice like a specific kind of calm, picked up on the second ring. Tate, what's wrong? She told her. All of it. The traffic stop, Stroud, the field test, the fluorescent light with the flicker, the water she hadn't touched, Aubin and his careful stillness, Delisle and his folder. When she finished, Gwen was quiet for 3 seconds. Are you hurt? Knees bad? Otherwise, no. Okay. Another second. I need you to do something for me. Don't get in the car yet. Gwen. I'm calling Marcus. Marcus Thibault was Gwen's colleague. Tatum had met him once at a firm Christmas party. Tall, Quebecois, the kind of lawyer who listened to what you said instead of the words you were using to say it. She'd thought he was good at his job. She had not expected to need him. She stood in the parking lot and breathed cold air and waited. Gwen called back in 4 minutes. He wants to meet you tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock, his office on Elgin. Tell him I'll be there. Tate, her sister's voice shifted. You know this isn't your fault. I know, do you though? She looked up at the sky. Ottawa in January. The clouds were low and thick, and the orange of the streetlights reflected off them and made the night look warmer than it was. I'm working on it, she said. The next 6 weeks were not linear. That was the thing nobody told you about situations like this. That they didn't move in a straight line from incident to resolution, that they folded back on themselves, that there were days when it seemed like nothing was moving, and then suddenly 3 things happened at once, and you couldn't process all of them. Marcus filed a formal complaint with the Ottawa Police Services Board within 48 hours of their first meeting. He was precise and unhurried, and used language she had to occasionally ask him to define. He also listened to her, which she had not taken for granted. The professional standards review proceeded. Sergeant Delisle sent her updates by email, brief and formal, every 10 days or so. She read them carefully and filed them in a folder on her laptop. Stroud's record, which Marcus obtained through disclosure, revealed 2 previous complaints. One from a woman in Vanier who'd been detained for 40 minutes during a wellness check. One from a man in Centretown who'd filed a written complaint that had been closed after investigation with a notation that read, unsubstantiated. Both had occurred within the past 3 years. Both involved individuals who had flagged a medical condition before Stroud proceeded with a physical assessment. Marcus presented this pattern in a written submission that was 8 pages long. Tatum went back to work. This was important to her, going back to work. She'd taken 2 days after the incident, not because she'd been told to, but because she'd woken up on the Wednesday morning and found that she couldn't locate the version of herself that walked into St. Michael's and functioned well under pressure, and she'd thought, give it 2 days. She gave it 2 days. On the Thursday morning, she'd found that version of herself again, or something close enough to it, and she'd gone in. Her colleagues knew. The night charge nurse, a woman named Bev who had worked trauma for 22 years and had the energy of someone who had simply decided not to be surprised by anything anymore, had pulled her aside on her first shift back and said, quietly and without drama, if you need to leave early, you leave early, no questions, just go. Then she'd gone back to her charts. Tatum had not left early, but she'd thought about that offer more than once in the weeks that followed. The review board hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late February. She'd been told she could submit a written statement or appear in person. Marcus recommended in person. Not because it will necessarily change the outcome, he said, over coffee at his office on Elgin, but because you should be in the room. You were in the room when it happened. You should be in the room when it's addressed. She thought about that for a long time. Then she said, I'll be there. The night before, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink and wrote out by hand the things she wanted to say. Not a script she didn't want to script, just a map, the order of things, the sequence she needed to hold on to. She wrote the stop, the light in the mirror, both hands on the wheel. She wrote the walk, her knee, the thing she'd said about Helmand and the thing that hadn't changed in his expression when she said it. She wrote 40 minutes, the flicker in the fluorescent light, the water she didn't drink. She wrote Aubin, midnight queue. He didn't want you to sit there any longer. She looked at that last line for a while. Then she wrote, the point is not that one person did the right thing. The point is that without him, none of this would be here. The hearing room at the Ottawa Police Services Board was smaller than she'd expected. Wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, with a long table at the front and rows of chairs facing it. There were about 20 people in the room when she arrived. She recognized Aubin near the back in his uniform. He caught her eye and gave a small nod. She nodded back. The board chair opened the session and read out the formal summary of the complaint. Tatum listened to her own experience described in procedural language. The complainant was subjected to a field sobriety assessment in contravention of standard protocol. following disclosure of a documented physical disability without sufficient grounds for initial vehicle stop, and felt the strange doubling of it, the way it was both accurate and completely empty of what it had actually felt like to stand on Carling Avenue in the dark with her hands behind her back. When it was her turn, she stood up. She had the handwritten notes in her jacket pocket. She didn't take them out. She spoke for 11 minutes. She talked about the stop and the field test and the 40 minutes in the room. She talked about what it meant to serve, in uniform overseas, in scrubs at home, and to be treated as a suspect on a street she'd driven 100 times. She talked about the 2 previous complaints and what a pattern meant, and what it meant when a pattern was called unsubstantiated. Then she said, "I want to be careful about something. I don't believe this is about one officer. I think Officer Stroud failed me that night, and I think the record suggests he's failed others. But I also think the system that allowed a complaint to be marked unsubstantiated without follow-up failed all of us. I'm not here because I want one person to lose his job. I'm here because I don't want to sit in that room again, and I don't want someone else to sit in that room because nobody said anything." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. The board's decision came 12 days later. Officer Stroud was dismissed from the Ottawa Police Service. The 2 previous complaints were formally reopened and reinvestigated. The board announced a procedural review of field sobriety assessment protocols with a specific focus on how disclosed physical disabilities were to be documented and accommodated prior to any physical evaluation. The review was to be completed within 4 months and submitted to the Ontario Civilian Police Commission. Marcus sent her the decision by email with a single line below the attachment. "This is good work. Yours, not mine." She read it at the nursing station, between a discharge summary and a chart update, with the noise of the trauma unit moving around her in its usual way. Monitors, voices, the specific rattle of a supply cart with a loose wheel that someone had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. She read it twice. Then she filed it in the folder on her phone, next to Delisle's updates and the formal complaint and the page she'd written by hand the night before the hearing. She went back to work. Constable Aubin transferred to the Professional Standards Division 6 weeks after the hearing. She heard about it through Delisle, who sent one of his brief formal emails mentioning it in passing, a notation at the end, almost as an afterthought. She thought about whether to reach out. She thought about what she'd say. She thought about the fact that what he'd done was not extraordinary, in the sense that it was something any officer should have done, and that making too much of it might obscure that point. In the end, she wrote him a card, one of the plain ones from the rack at the drugstore on Bank Street. No flowers on it, no sentiment printed inside. She wrote, "You reviewed a queue at midnight and decided something was wrong. I don't think you knew what that would mean for anyone else. I'm not sure it matters whether you did. Thank you." She mailed it to the Professional Standards office on Lycan Drive. She didn't know if he'd get it. She sent it anyway, because some things needed to be said even when you couldn't be certain they'd land. 3 days later, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. The message was 14 seconds long, a voice she recognized, measured and carefully saying, "Corporal Brooke, I got your card. Thank you for writing it. I hope your knee is holding up." She listened to it once. Then she saved it, the way you save things that are small and specific, and remind you that people exist inside their choices, not outside them. She drove home down Carling Avenue. 48 in a 50 zone, both hands on the wheel. The streetlights moving over the roof of the car in the way they always had, in the way they would continue to, indifferent and reliable, and exactly where they were supposed to be. The road was hers. It always had been. She drove it like she knew that now.